Welcome to City Minutes, where we discuss new research that helps us understand the UK's largest cities and towns and policy ideas to improve their economic performance. I'm your host, Andrew Carter from the think tank Centre for Cities. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to this episode of City Minutes. Today I'm joined by my colleague Maurice Lange, and we're going to be talking about our latest report, which is called Flat Britain, the Urban Density Gap and How to Close It, of which Maurice is the lead author. Hello, Maurice.
Hello, Andrew.
So let's talk about housing. Let's talk about housing in cities and talk about density. So just tell us a little bit about what we did, how we thought about this issue, how it fits, and then we'll get into some of the findings and then indeed what we think might need to be done about it.
Yeah, so when it came to thinking about this research, we kind of started with three overarching observations about density, which is we have a house building problem, a housing shortage. If you're going to fix that, you need more houses. You need more houses in cities. And if you build more houses in cities, then that makes cities denser. There's also kind of an economic imperative. So good urban economic research shows that denser places are generally more productive. So if you're wanting to grow the economy, then you also want to be densifying cities. And then from a kind of planning angle, there's been a brownfield first agenda for many decades. And so, that's all about recognizing that we want to make as efficient use of land as possible. And so you've got these three reasons. You want more houses in cities, you want more density for productivity and brownfield first. But then you've also got the observation that our cities, we know at quite a high level, they're not very dense. And our house building rates are lowest in cities, and they've been low in cities for a very long time, as we showed in a bit of research last year. And so it's kind of this conundrum that there's lots of reasons you want density, but we don't have it. So that moves us to a slightly more detailed question, which was the focus of this paper, which is where should you expect higher densities if density itself is a generic good? So where should you expect higher densities? And then looking at where density distributes at the moment, where is the biggest kind of gap? And the way that we do that is we look at density in British cities, but we also look at France and Japan, and we go, how do we observe density differing within and between cities of different sizes, between different countries? And let's say France and Japan are doing one thing and we're doing another, then potentially you could expect more density or less density. Whereas if they're all doing the same thing, you wouldn't think there's a gap.
Okay, so anybody that knows anything about this subject won't be surprised to know that there is an urban density gap. We start from that assumption. The assumption is proven right. So let's just talk a little bit about the size and scale and the nature of the urban density gap, particularly, as you say, when you compare British cities and then you compare them to French cities of comparable standing and Japanese cities of comparable standing. So just give us the scale, first off, of the urban density gap in numbers.
Yeah, well, the number we come up with is at least 2.3 million missing homes. And what that means is, so we cut cities in two different ways in the paper. We cut them by size grouping. So overall, you'd expect bigger cities to perform differently to smaller cities. And we do. We see a global trend. Bigger cities are denser than smaller ones. And then we also chop the city into different segments. So we look at distance from city centre, and then we define this thing called the urban core, which is the bit of the city which is mostly housing. Mm-hmm. So it's important to think about that as not the city centre, but it's just the wider area which comprises most of the city. And then everything outside of the urban core is kind of like your outer suburbs and your commuter towns. And so that 2.3 million figure is if we took the urban cores of all 62 British cities and they were as dense as the average French or Japanese equivalent, how many houses would you have more within that core? And that's 2.3 million homes.
And we find that, so there's a gap between British cities and Japanese and French cities across the board, but the biggest gap is in our biggest cities, and the biggest gap is in our bigger cities. So just say a little bit about, give me some flavor of the difference and the gap between some of the big cities and their comparable big cities in the other two countries.
Yeah, so we've got 25 small cities, 25 medium cities, 12 big cities, and 1 London in Britain. If If you take all of their urban cores, those 12 big cities are responsible for over half of that total 2.3 million gap. So at least 1 million missing. And if you compare them to French cities, that's over 1.5 million missing homes in the big cities alone.
So that's the kind of big city. And then within the work, we are also then sort of comparing city X with city Y to give even more detail on that. So again, just give us a couple of examples on that.
So just as the density gap is smaller in small cities than it is in big cities, we also see that if you compare the smaller of the big cities, so cities like Leicester or Cardiff, with their comparators, and then you compare like Manchester and Leeds and Birmingham with similar population sized cities in France and Japan, the gap for those big cities is much, much bigger. If, let's say, Leeds was as dense as Marseille, within its urban core, there would be nearly 200,000 homes more within a 5-kilometre distance from the city centre. The same is true for comparing Manchester and Sapporo in Japan, or Birmingham and Fukuoka or whatever. And then, the medium-sized big cities, it's a medium-sized gap. And then the smaller ones, it's funny because in France and Japan, the bigger the big city, the denser they are in general. Whereas our densest big cities are Bristol and Edinburgh, and they're some of the smallest in population terms. So there's something going wrong in density and the way that cities are able to shape their urban form in response to their local economies, as compared to how it works in other countries.
Okay, and then the other big finding in this sort of space is that if that's a sort of static picture as to the difference in density, what we also observe is over the last 10 to 20 years that actually the density gap is widening or getting bigger between British cities and French and Japanese cities.
Yeah, so we're able to take kind of snapshots at census years, so 2010/11 and then 2020/2021-2. And if you look at how density has changed over time within these cities, it's basically like counting the numbers of houses, but you can distribute them in space. And we find that over 1/6 of the density gap today has appeared only in that last 10 years. And that's because we're building much less within our urban cores than cities in France and Japan have been able to do.
Which is an interesting finding that dense cities seem to be more capable and find it easier to add even more density into their already dense areas, whereas we aren't very dense, but we aren't able to densify.
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of density inertia thing, which presents a real policy challenge for the UK cities, definitely.
And we also look at the nature, the type of housing seems to be the reason behind this urban density gap. Just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So if you go in the report, you'll see cities represented with lots of different colours. You've got oranges for medium to high densities, reds for really dense, and you've got deep purples for like the very, very dense. And you can see in British cities some high rises represented as those purple colours. But then what you can do is you can kind of add up the contribution of those different types of neighborhoods to the density gap. And you can go, what is your missing type of neighborhood? And what we find is that it's not those missing high rises. It's actually, if you look at big cities in Japan and France, there aren't so many of those really, really tall buildings, making them dense. What it is that it's those medium densities, medium to high densities, which French and Japanese cities have quite a lot of, compared to the British cities, that makes up most of that density gap overall. And so what we did was we go, okay, so running the numbers, it's these orange neighborhoods. What happens if we plonk ourselves down on Google Maps and go looking around? What are these orange neighborhoods like? And the answer is they're not super talls, they're medium-rise housing. And it's exactly the type of housing which you don't find a lot of in Britain. If you go to UK cities and you go into those orange neighborhoods, mostly they are terraced housing, and they might be back-to-back terraced housing or slightly taller terraced housing, but they're not generally made up of apartment blocks like they are in France and Japan. And so we make this observation that in French and Japanese cities, you have apartment blocks over a much larger area of the city. They're mixed in with neighborhoods which have houses or terraced housing in them. Sometimes they're terraced housing which has been extended upwards. And I guess that gives a kind of flexibility and range of densities that you can see. And that range of densities is kind of increased by the presence of flats. Whereas in British cities, 80% of houses within the urban core in the big cities are houses, and that compares to 20 or 30% of dwellings being houses in French and Japanese equivalents. And it's that difference between houses and flats that makes a real difference in density terms.
Yeah, so it's not the issue around when you go into the very city center of these places and see lots of tall towers, which you see in some of our big cities. That's not what we're talking about. As you say, we're talking about outside of the core area, the CBD area, and we're talking about typically mid-rise housing of somewheres between 4 and 9 stories, not your very tall towers of 30 plus or whatever it is. So it's kind of interesting to think about that as the missing component rather than having lots more very, very, very tall towers. That doesn't seem to be the reason why we see the density gap
Yeah,
between British cities and French and Japanese cities.
Yeah, and I think we get in the paper to a pretty good explanation of why that is the case. Like, tall towers are pretty expensive per meter squared to build. And so they end up being for the higher end of the market if you're building a 30 meter squared tower, usually. And there's really only so much demand for that type of housing that you're going to get in a city. And you're also unlikely to find that demand for that appearing in zone 5 or kilometer 5 away from the city. So you see those appearing in city centres, you don't see them appearing elsewhere. And then it's more cost effective to deliver houses that are medium heights, which make a good use of the land, more than developing housing on that same amount of land does, but they don't incur those same sort of costs that building a super tall glassy building does.
Great. Okay, so I was starting to talk a little bit about what's to be done or what needs to be done if we want to try and close the urban density gap. Obviously, loads of detail in the reports, which you'll have to go to look at it all. On the one hand, there's a bunch of stuff which is about making building in urban areas slightly more easy by removing some of the bottlenecks or the constraints in terms of doing that. And we've written about that and talked about that in other podcasts as well, which you can listen to. But I want you to touch on two things. One is just about the amount of land that's available for development, because we've got something to say on that. And then secondly, we've got something to say about actually the degree to which we specify or expect rates of density higher than what we've currently got. So say something about that. So do the development land bit first.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important parts of the research is when we look at that density change over time, we're able to map it. And what you see in French and Japanese cities is right across the urban core, there's some building happening. It's very unlikely that you go to a bit of a neighborhood and go, nothing has happened here in the last 10 years. Whereas if you look at the distribution of density change in British cities, what you see is it's much more kind of spiky or constrained to particular locations. So often you'll see quite a lot what's happened in the city centre, and then you might see that in a bit of infill has happened here, etc., etc. But most neighbourhoods don't appear as a place that has changed if you look at the maps that we were able to produce. And so this kind of leads us to go, okay, so why is that happening? And I think that has a lot to do with the way that we do planning in the UK. Mm-hmm. So if you go to a local plan, if a local authority has one, it'll make a differentiation between strategic sites, allocated sites, and everywhere else. And so stuff is expected to happen on strategic sites, and you might get some information about what's expected, and then everywhere else has to go through the discretionary process. And that's really different to the way that cities are planned in France and Japan. If you go to a French city, you won't have that distinction between allocated site and non-allocated site. You will have a zone which applies to this bit of the city, which says you can build this type of thing here. Mm-hmm. And so that means that, okay, so you might have your bigger projects that are happening in a broadly similar way to British cities, but you've also got lots of smaller type stuff, which is able to happen not through an allocation, but because everybody knew it was possible, and then the developer will bring that forward. And I think that has quite a strong bearing on how cities are able to evolve over the time. We look at average stock age. Houses in the UK are really old. And I think that's another thing that points us towards, we're not recycling existing urban land. Once you've built a house in the UK, the system just expects it to be there kind of forever. Mm-hmm. And we look at demolition rates. You look at the average demolition rate in the UK, your house will be remaining for the next 3,500 years. It will be before, and we'll have another coming of Christ before all of the houses in the UK have been demolished at current rates. And French and Japanese cities are they demolish more. They say this, we can add density here, and that means demolishing a house of 2 or 3 stories and building something bigger in its place. And for as long as the UK cities don't do that so much, they'll be stuck in the low densities.
So that relates to the second issue, right? Which is not just about making land available, but actually accepting and encouraging the nature of the use on that land to change as well, rather than just simply to replicate, which goes to what we were discussing earlier.
And I think so. We talk about some very basic things which exist in local plans, even within the urban core of cities, which just simply need to change. So that might be that they require car parking. It's very difficult to build flats and deliver car parking at the same time. Same thing with outdoor amenity space. If you define that too big in your local plan, then you'll never get a flat with a balcony. You have to build gardens. And so for as long as you've got those very basic things, which do exist within local plans within cities, density is going to be, it just has to be low. And then there's other stuff that any given development that needs to come forward has to be in keeping with the local character. You're not going to get a break from the existing norm. And it's the low risk strategy for a developer to come in and propose a low density scheme. Yeah. And so all of those things will need to be corrected for in local plans within cities if things are going to change.
Okay, so let's say the detail of all those is in the report, obviously. One of the questions which we touch on but don't fully resolve is if you built, well, firstly, do Britons want to live at higher density? Isn't this a non-British way of life that we don't aspire to or want? So therefore you can build all of these things, but no one will inhabit them. We kind of look at that. So just say something briefly on that.
Yeah, so we've not done a big survey of the British people to understand if they would live in a flat. But we also look at the proportion of households that are living in flats versus houses in different cities across the world. And in Britain, in England and Wales, as I said earlier, sort of like 20-30% of households live in flats within cities. But then you cross the border to Scotland, and there you're at 50-60%. And so Scottish living in flats, because they've got old tenement flats by and large, is much more similar to that in France and Japan. And we would say, okay, I think it's unlikely that English people are an outlier here, and it's therefore likely to be because English people particularly demand gardens and house-based living. I think if you built the flats, people would come probably.
Yeah, that's a fair observation, I think. Okay, so where does that sort of leave us? This is an ongoing area of investigation for us. There's bits and pieces in the report suggesting other work that we are currently thinking about, currently developing. So just say a little bit about what we're doing next, where our thinking is going.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, we've got this distinction between how different planning systems work. You've got zoning systems in France and Japan, and they, specify rules for different places. Now, it is possible to introduce that through the UK system. And in the paper, we trail a bit of work that we've been doing looking at data on Croydon. Croydon introduced a supplementary planning document for a 3.5-year period. And when it did that, it saw a 3-fold increase in suburban intensification type developments. So small piecemeal infill developments like I was talking about before. And we advocate for the greater, more widespread use of this type of tool in the British system. One question we want to have a bit of a think about in this piece coming up is, okay, so if you introduced a Croydon-style planning document in a place with lower land values like Manchester or Leeds, would you expect to see the same type of development happening as a result? Mm-hmm. Because in Croydon, you know that if you buy this house, you knock it down, you build another one, you can sell the resulting flats for quite a lot of money and cover your build costs. And we're going to do a bit of work to try and understand whether that same thing would stack up in cities with lower house prices. And if it wouldn't, what kind of buildings would you have to permit to see suburban intensification happen on a piecemeal basis? So I think that's answering a bit of a kind of chicken and egg problem. Our big cities are low density. That's probably having a negative knock-on impact for their productivity. But how much could you rely on the private sector if it was enabled to start filling that density gap for as long as there's lower demand? Or do you need a kind of bigger bang public sector intervention to really drive up densities, which would have a knock-on impact on your economy, which would then start to lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy? So that's going to be a bit of work that we work out over the next couple of months. And then today, as we record this podcast, we put out a little bit of a data tool, which will allow people to look at what data is like in each of their cities. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be turning that into a spatial tool. So you'll be able to go on a map of your city and find out what the housing density is in this location and see how that compares to the French and Japanese peers. So hopefully that should be a good, fun way for people to interact with the stories that we're telling around density in cities. And I guess finally, what I'd say is we've built this really interesting data set, which knits together satellites and house building data from these 3 countries. We've also got some data on some other countries and some other countries which don't work. But if anybody's been sort of excited by the data and wants to get in touch, get access to it, has some ideas about what we might be able to do with it, please do. I'd love to hear from you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Maurice. Good summary of some of the findings, but no means all. Lots more detail in the report, Flat Britain, the urban density gap and how to close it. It's available on our website, centreforcities.org. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of City Minutes, brought to you by the Centre for Cities. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Podbean by searching Centre for Cities. Please rate and subscribe if you like what you heard. Centre for Cities is an independent think tank dedicated to improving the economies of UK's largest cities and towns. You can follow the Centre on Twitter at Centre for Cities, all one word, or on LinkedIn for the latest on what the Centre is up to. To hear all about our latest reports and briefings and upcoming events, sign up to our fortnightly newsletter via our website, centreforcities.org. If you'd like to get in touch, do tweet us or send an email to info@centreforcities.org.